Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo vanjsku politiku Sjedinjenih američkih država i izazove s kojima se suočava. Ideja o američkoj globalnoj hegemoniji datira još od vremena Benjamina Franklina, ali je u suštini došla do izražaja tek nakon Drugog svjetskog rata i pobjede saveznika predvođenih SAD-om. Amerika je tad izašla kao dominantna ekonomska, vojna i tehnološka sila, a taj status je zadržala do danas. Međutim, sa sve hrabrijom Rusijom i snažnijom Kinom, brojni postavljaju pitanje je li Amerika i dalje dominantan faktor u svijetu ili je došao kraj američkom unipolarnom momentu. Prije nego što prijeđemo na analize, pogledajmo uvodni prilog o američkom utjecaju u svijetu od kraja Drugog svjetskog rata do danas.
Tokom hladnog rata Sjedinjene američke države imale su samo jednog rivala, Sovjetski savez. Iako su Sovjeti vojno mogli parirati Amerikancima, kada je riječ o ekonomiji i proizvodnji, mnogo su zaostajali za njima. Amerikanci su imali jake saveznike širom svijeta, dok su sovjetski saveznici bile zapravo autoritativne države istočne Europe, često pod sovjetskom vojnom okupacijom. A onda je nakon raspada Sovjetskog saveza SAD postao neprikosnovena vojna i politička sila. Govorilo se o američkom unipolarnom momentu. Sjedinjene države su smatrale da niko ne može ugroziti njihovu sigurnost. Zatim se dogodio 11. septembar 2001. Washington je ubrzo shvatio da se suočava s novom vrstom izazova. Ovaj put riječ je o oružanim grupama, a ne konvencionalnoj vojsci. Kao odgovor na napade uslijedile su invazije na Irak i Afganistan, na koje su potrošene stotine milijardi dolara. Rezultat je bio suprotan od američkih geopolitičkih ciljeva. Svrgavanje Sadama Huseina otvorilo je prostor šitima u Iraku i samo je ojačalo susjedni Iran. A u Afganistanu, nakon prvobitnog povlačenja, talibani ponovo kontrolišu znatan dio zemlje. Ti ratovi, smatraju mnogi stručnjaci, bili su vojni debakl, takozvani rat protiv terorizma, kovanica bivšeg američkog predsjednika Georgea W. Busha, ciljao je muslimane, islamske organizacije i aktiviste, a kao rezultat dodatno je narušio ugled SAD-a u zemljama s većinskim muslimanskim stanovništvom. Uslijedila je globalna finansijska kriza 2008. godine. Američki budžetski deficit je porastao i SAD je počeo pozajmljivati novac od drugih država. Američka vojska nakon 14 godina ratovanja u Iraku i Afganistanu bila je iscrpljena. Osim toga, ekonomski rast Kine i njena sve hrabrija vanjska politika u Aziji, ali i oporavljena Rusija s reformisanom vojskom postali su ozbiljna prijetnja američkoj dominaciji u svijetu. SAD više nije mogao biti jedini svjetski policajac. Formiranje grupe ISIL u Iraku, a kasnije i u Siriji i Afganistanu, slažu se stručnjaci, posljedica je nepromišljenih američkih invazija. A oklijevanje bivšeg američkog predsjednika Baracka Obame da interveniše u Siriji otvorilo je prostor rastu radikalnih grupa, ali je pružio priliku i Rusiji da postane nezaobilazan faktor u tom dijelu svijeta. Podrška SAD-a oružanim kurdskim grupama na sjeveru Sirije, koje turska vlada smatra terorističkim, kao i njihova nespremnost da podrže Ankaru u borbi protiv ISIL-a, samo su udaljili Tursku od NATO saveza i SAD-a. Svijet je postao multipolaran, a to znači da jedna država više neće moći sama odlučivati o međunarodnoj politici. Dragan Stanimirović, Al Jazeera.
Gost u emisiji Granice istoka je Francis Fukuyama, profesor na Univerzitetu Stanford. Professor Fukuyama, hello and welcome to our show. Now, in the early 1990s, Charles Grodham wrote about the American unipolar moment. When did the unipolar moment exactly end, or to use Zachariah's phrase, are we living in a post-American world?
I think that American moment ended in 2008 with the American financial crisis, the subprime crisis on Wall Street. That was the moment when it was clear that the American economy had been based on excessive buildups of debt. There was a huge recession that was the largest since the Great Depression, and ever since then, the American economy has been underperforming. And I think that's the moment in which China powered ahead and has been displacing American power in many parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, but many are attributing the end of the unipolar moment to the fiasco in Iraq. Now, as a public intellectual, you were someone who was associated with the neoconservative movement. How will history judge public intellectuals who made the case for the war in Iraq?
Well, I think, first of all, I actually was quite critical of the war. I think
initially or afterwards?
You know, I said pretty clearly before the war started that without United Nations authorization, the United States shouldn't invade Iraq. I think that it was a disaster in, you know, virtually every respect in terms of American credibility, in terms of just the waste of lives and money. And I think it set off a period of instability in the Middle East that we're still living with.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it not ironic that the net beneficiary of the war in Iraq is actually Iran, and a key foreign policy objective of the neoconservative movement was to contain Iran, and now Iran is more strong than ever?
No, you're absolutely correct. I think that it was a consequence that should have been anticipated by them, and it wasn't, because I think they were looking at it in a narrow, very American frame where the issue was just democracy versus Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, and they didn't see this as one of, you know, Shiite power throughout the Gulf and in the greater Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Now, how does the United States view Turkey today?
Well, I think that Turkey has actually ceased to be a liberal democracy. It's a democracy.
Why would you say so?
Well, I think that the rule of law has been undermined by President Erdogan. I think that you know, he was right to respond to the coup attempt last year, but he's tremendously overreacted in terms of jailing, you know, professors, civil servants, military officers, and he's used that, I think, to eliminate the kinds of legal protections that the Turks used to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. But would you say Turkey is flirting more with Russia and the Iranians now than it is with NATO?
It's very complicated. I think that Turkey wants to play a balancer in that region, and its foreign policy is not simply guided by any simple ideological alignment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. With the rise of new regional powers and non-state actors, how do you see the role of the United States in the new global order?
Well, I think that American power is still pretty critical in traditional areas of American commitment. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, the NATO alliance is still quite important as a deterrent to any kind of Russian aggression. I think that the relationships with Japan and South Korea remain very important in Asia. I think that the problem area for the United States has always been the Middle East, where our policy has oftentimes been confused and inconsistent.
Why is that so? I mean, this is something that many people have noticed.
Well, it's the combination of a lot of things. I think part of it is conflicting interests. So the United States has this continuing commitment to Israel, but it also wants access to oil. It's been very inconsistent in its support for democracy in that region. I think that
well, at the same time, it's had very stable relationships with authoritarian regimes.
That's right. That's right. And so it's both oil and the war on terror that have caused it to, you know, have these relationships with authoritarian regimes. And so the U.S. has very mixed motives in that region. I think there's also just a knowledge problem that the United States really has never developed the capacity to really understand a lot of the complexities of policy in that area. And I'm afraid the new administration is going to be worse because they don't seem to think it's important to develop expertise.
But Washington has had plenty of time to develop its policies towards the Middle East. I mean, it has been present there since 1933 when they first struck oil in Saudi Arabia. Why?
Well, I think it's the short-term mentality of a lot of American administrations. And then, as I said, the underlying problem is simply that we're pursuing contradictory policies, you know, that serve different ends. And I think, you know, that's what causes the inconsistency in, for example, the support for democracy in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. How do you comment the rise of non-liberal democracies in Eastern Europe?
I think it's very troubling. I think that this started...
and also within the European Union.
Yes. Well, I think this really started with President Putin in Russia. It's a kind of populist nationalism in which leaders are using a democratic mandate to undermine the rule of law and consolidate their power. So this is true, I think, of Putin in Russia. It's true of Erdogan in Turkey. It's true of Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's true of the Kaczynski government in Poland. And unfortunately, I think Donald Trump has a number of these, you know, instincts as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess many people ask you this question, but your article on the end of history is perhaps your most famous work, one of the most widely cited works from the early 1990s. How has your thesis stood the test of time?
Well, the thesis was really about the direction of history. The end of history means where is history heading? And I think in that respect, although we are hitting a really rough patch for many democracies, that still is the basic direction. It's still the default form of government for a large part of the world. But that doesn't mean that the course of democratic development is going to be always upwards. And in fact, we have been in a recession where democracy has been under a lot of stress over the last decade.
All right, Professor Fukuyama, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much.
Poštovani gledalci, bio je to Francis Fukuyama, profesor na Univerzitetu Stanford. Sjedinjene Američke Države projektuju svoju političku silu i vojnim putem. Po broju aktivnih vojnika, na prvom mjestu u svijetu je zapravo Kina sa 2,2 milijuna aktivnih vojnika. Na drugom mjestu je Indija sa 1,4 milijuna vojnika, a tek na trećem mjestu su Sjedinjene Američke Države sa 1,3 milijuna vojnika. Ipak, trenutni američki vojni budžet iznosi 596 milijardi dolara i najveći je u svijetu. Poređenja radi, to je veličina kombinovanog vojnog budžeta Velike Britanije, Francuske, Saudijske Arabije, Indije, Rusije, Kine i Japana. Vojni budžet ostalih zemalja svijeta iznosi kumulativni 514 milijardi dolara. Američka vojska ima 2830 tenkova i 450 lansera interkontinentalnih balističkih raketa koje mogu pogoditi mete udaljene više hiljada kilometara. Na raspolaganju imaju 3476 vojnih aviona, zatim 157 bombardera, 760 vojnih helikoptera i 637 bespilotnih letjelica. Kako bi u kratkom roku njihovi avioni i helikopteri mogli biti operativni bilo gdje u svijetu, koriste se nosači aviona, preciznije njih 10, neki od kojih imaju čak 6000 članova posade. Uz to, američka vojska posjeduje i 68 podmornica, zatim 93 ratna broda i 30 amfibijskih brodova. A od kako je došao na vlast, predsjednik Donald Trump je obećao da će povećati vojni budžet Amerike za dodatnih 54 milijarde dolara. Strateški lociran na raskršću Europe, Azije i Afrike, Bliski istok je dugo važna tačka vanjske politike Sjedinjenih Američkih Država. Na Bliskom istoku nalazi se više od polovine naftnih rezervi svijeta i regija je najveći izvoznik nafte na planeti. Kao najveći potrošač ovog energenta, SAD ima interesa u održavanju slobodnog protoka nafte i zemnog plina iz ove regije. Također, mnogi američki saveznici zavise od bliskoistočnih energenata, pa je to i američki interes. Sjedinjene Američke Države imaju jake vojne, sigurnosne, obavještajne i diplomatske veze sa nekoliko bliskoistočnih država, među kojima su Izrael, Egipat, Jordan te članice Vijeća za ljudske saradnje.
Moskva već decenijama pomno prati dešavanje na Bliskom istoku. Početak arapskog proljeća 2011. godine nije išao u korist Moskvi, jer je time izgubila neke svoje saveznike i ekonomske klijente. Zato je Rusija pokušala očuvati svoje prijatelje na vlasti tamo gdje je mogla, poput Bašara al-Asada u Siriji ili podržati kontrarevolucionarne pokrete poput generala Abdela Fataha al-Sisija u Egiptu ili generala Halife Haftara u Libiji. Međutim, ruska vojna intervencija u Siriji obilježila je zvanični povratak Moskve kao glavnog igrača na bliskoistočnoj političkoj sceni. Bombardovanje Sirije i slanje oružanih snaga u tu zemlju predstavlja treću prekograničnu vojnu ofanzivu Rusije u proteklih 9 godina, nakon invazije Gruzije 2008. i Ukrajine 2014. godine. Zanimljivo je da sve te zemlje u kojima je Rusija vojno intervenisala imaju izlaz na more. Gruzijska pokrajina Abhazija ima izlaz na Crno more, baš kao i ukrajinski poluotok Krim, dok sirijska luka Latakija ima izlaz na Mediteran. Izlaz na more omogućava Rusiji bržu projekciju svoje vojne i ekonomske moći na Mediteran, ali i u svijetu. Sigurnosni izvori tvrde da Rusija pregovara i o uspostavljanju vojnih baza na istoku Libije i zapadu Egipta kako bi pojačali svoje prisustvo na Mediteranu. Po pitanju Sirije, Moskva je zajedno sa Ankarom i Teheranom doslovno potisnula SAD iz cijele priče i sebe nametnula kao glavnog medijatora u mirovnom procesu. Više je razloga ruskom uplitanju u Siriju. Moskva želi dokazati da joj sankcije zapadnih država i međunarodna izolacija nakon invazije Krima nisu naštetile, te da je ona i dalje svjetska sila i bitan igrač na globalnoj sceni. Rusija također želi pokazati svoju vojnu moć nakon modernizacije oružanih snaga koja je započela 2008. godine. Demonstrirala je to ispaljivanjem krstarećih raketa sa brodova na Kaspijskom moru koje su pogodile mete udaljene čak 1500 kilometara u Siriji. Na diplomatskom polju samo u protekle 2 godine ruski predsjednik Vladimir Putin sastao se sa liderima bliskoistočnih zemalja 25 puta, za razliku od bivšeg američkog predsjednika Baracka Obame koji se sastao samo sa 5 u istom vremenskom okviru. Slične ambicije je imao i Sovjetski savez. Sovjeti su vojno i finansijski podržavali arapske socijalističke pokrete u Egiptu, Siriji, Iraku i Jemenu, dok su Sjedinjene države podržavale Izrael i monarhije Arapskog zaljeva. Predsjednik Putin sada želi obnoviti staru slavu, a neki kažu možda otići čak i korak dalje. Jasmina Mamaleđija, Al Jazeera.
Nastavljamo analizirati američku vanjsku politiku, ali ovog puta sa aspekta ljudskih prava. Sa nama u studiju je profesor Jared O'Neill Bell, stručnjak za međunarodne odnose. Professor Bell, hello and welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me on.
Right. When you look at Iraq today, was the invasion America's biggest military fiasco in recent history? Billions of dollars spent, and as a result, we have a Shiite pro-Iranian government in power. Not quite what the U.S. expected.
No, of course not. The United States invaded Iraq without doing proper preparation and planning, and this is what the end result was, is things that like a pro-Iranian government, or the country is completely divided by sectarian realities now that they hadn't realized beforehand. I think the Bush administration based the invasion on after 1991, the situation in Iraq after 1991, and didn't realize that there was so many sectarian divisions that Saddam Hussein's regime actually kept put together.
How would you explain the rapid rise of sectarianism in post-Saddam Iraq? Was it something that erupted after the U.S. invasion, or was it present there during Saddam Hussein's rule?
You know, there's always a debate between scholars about how much to the sectarian rule actually, or sectarian divide actually existed in Iraq. As I just noted previously, that the sectarian divide was there, but it wasn't actually quite as pronounced as after the U.S. had invaded. A third of Iraqi marriages were actually mixed marriages among people of different sects. So this actually points to the fact that it wasn't as great as before the U.S. invasion. However, after the U.S. invasion, the U.S. kind of politicized these sectarian differences.
Why?
I think the U.S. kind of propped up the Shia minority and thought they could possibly take advantage of this once repressed minority,
right,
or majority actually, and take advantage of that and use that to their advantage. But unfortunately, it rather backfired.
Why was the U.S. so reluctant to intervene in Syria?
I think the U.S. was rather reluctant to intervene in Syria because it was a calculated risk, essentially. The U.S. didn't know.
So it wasn't an issue of the U.S. military being overstretched?
I think it was an issue of the U.S. military being overstretched, but I think it also fell down to politics. I think the Obama administration at the time particularly looked at what are we going to get out of this actually? And especially as you mentioned, the U.S. military was completely overstretched with Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the situation in Libya and the situation in Benghazi completely and utterly made the Obama administration think otherwise, as to whether this would actually be a good idea, especially considering what the U.S. return would actually completely get out of it.
Was it an issue of the U.S. government not having enough public support for another war?
I think it was. I think it was both. I think it was about U.S. government not having enough support. I think many Americans actually supported some type of intervention. Recently, if you look at recent polls from...
Perhaps a humanitarian intervention like in Kosovo?
Yes, exactly. A humanitarian intervention. If we look at recent polls, it was like 41% disapproved of Donald Trump's strikes, and 50% actually approved. So that's, in a historical context, that's really low for a humanitarian intervention. It's because the majority of Americans simply, while they I think, see the images coming back on the television and they empathize with those particular things. However, I don't think we want to see actual combat troops on the ground.
Now, the Middle East was traditionally America's zone of interest, but now we see a very assertive Russia making its way and making it know that they are here to stay. Was Washington's reluctance to intervene in Syria seen as an opportunity for Moscow?
No, I wouldn't actually. I think if we look historically between the ties of former Soviet Union and Russia today, I think Syria was always a closer ally to Russia, and I think that's important to note in looking at the history, that there wasn't much for the United States to actually lose in this particular instance, as far as power or even influence. I think one of the key things that, if we look at why Russia has been so adamant, and one is that Russia's always been a friend to Syria, and I don't think it wanted to betray that image of leaving a friend in need. For various reasons. I think the second part is that Russia has a lot invested in Syria. It has access to its military base, to its air and naval bases in Syria, and it gives them access to the Mediterranean. So I think Russia was going to particularly going to be indicated in this fight one way or the other.
Now, how did you feel when you saw hundreds of thousands of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan fleeing through Turkey and Greece and making their way to Europe?
I think it's pretty horrifying. I think all the images we see on television or the things on social media, it's absolutely horrifying. But I don't know if that was enough to actually move public policy, especially in the EU. In 2013, Italy invested in a project called Operation Mare Nostrum, which was a project which is 150, which was a project to assist those who were fleeing Syria and North Africa with actually naval ships. However, the EU members rather turned its back and didn't want to fund that anymore because it became too expensive and it was subject to domestic politics at home. Unfortunately, this operation came to an end in October 2014. So then it was replaced with Operation Frontier, which essentially has been kind of something entirely different, which has kind of been a border protection and not something that's been designed to actually protect the refugees.
But we also saw European governments, putting up barbed wire fences and sending their soldiers to beat refugees who were making their way towards Europe.
Yes, unfortunately, I think the rise of populism and nationalist politics really got in the way, and I think we can connect that to the global economic crisis from 2008. I think this crisis really gave rise to nationalists and populists who really told people, look, these are the people who are to blame: immigrants, refugees, and that's far from the case actually. If we look at who bears the brunt of refugees, it's Turkey, it's Lebanon, it's bordering countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan.
Yeah.
So these are the key countries that actually are bearing the brunt of refugees, and the EU's not. I think one of the major issues in the EU also is that there is no actual integration strategy that they've been able to agree on across the board to actually integrate immigrants into their society. And of course, we know there's a lot of wariness now with threats of ISIS and ISIS influence with homegrown terrorism in Britain and France and Germany as well. So I think this has kind of stoked the fires of populism even more as attacks continue to happen in Western Europe.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sjedinjene Američke Države su i dalje dominantan faktor u međunarodnim odnosima, ali je očito da svijet više nije unipolaran. To se najbolje vidjelo 2015. godine dolaskom ruskih snaga na Bliski istok u odbranu režima sirijskog predsjednika Bašara al-Asada. To se također vidi i danas u Aziji, gdje Kina neprikosnoveno dominira morima i gdje se dugogodišnji američki saveznici poput Filipina okreću Kini i Rusiji. Washington će se morati suočiti sa multipolarnim svijetom gdje će djelovati mnoštvo regionalnih sila i nedržavnih aktera. Bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Cijelu emisiju možete pogledati na našem web portalu aljazeera.net/Balkans. Hvala na pažnji.